Okay, let's get started because it's 3:01 and I want to be cognizant of your precious time. And if others continue to join us, they'll just jump right in. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Create a Future Through Careers in Historic Preservation, which is part of our 2023 webinar series, Preserve the Past, Build for the Future. We're recording this session and we'll make it available shortly on our YouTube channel. I'm Susan Glimsher. I'm the Director of Communications, Education, and Outreach with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The ACHP is an independent federal agency that promotes the economic, educational, environmental, and cultural values of historic preservation. We also advise the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP also influences federal activities, programs, and policies that affect historic and cultural properties. We are comprised of 24 statutory members, and we are the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. A large part of the agency's work is overseeing the Section 106 review process. Section 106 is from the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies and all those who are receiving federal funding or federal licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out an undertaking. This webinar series fulfills several aspects of our mission: to educate the public about historic preservation, to bring young people into the field, and to build a more inclusive preservation program. We have 2 webinars left for this webinar series, Preserve the Past, Build for the Future, for this year. All of the webinars are held on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up on April 26th is History Right on Your Campus, Preserving HBCUs. And finally, on May 24th is Hallowed Ground, Preserving Historic Black Churches. I think both of those are going to be sensational, and I hope you'll join us there. You can register for one or both of these final webinars at the same registration link as this webinar, and we will also put it in the chat for you now. Also, you can find recordings of our past webinars on the ACHP website. We'll also put that link in the chat box. We are excited about our guests for today. They are Glenn Vaulx, who is a project coordinator at Self and Tucker Architect, Inc. in Memphis, Tennessee. And Glenn is a former ACHP intern, so it's a joy to have him back with us today. Nikita Reed, associate at Quinn Evans and host of the podcast Tangible Remnants. It's a great podcast. I would recommend that you all look it up and listen. Unfortunately, our third guest today, Rachel Klein, who is a historian and a history group supervisor with the U.S. Forest Service's Enterprise Program, won't be with us live due to unforeseen circumstances. However, we do have her presentation and we will be showing it. Before we begin, if you have any questions or comments or any discussion items during this webinar, please put them in the chat box. Once the speakers have finished their presentations, my colleague Lynn Richmond will pose your questions to the speakers. Now let's begin with Glenn. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Susan, for inviting me to speak. So my name is Glenn Vaulx. I work in Memphis, Tennessee at Self Tucker Architects. I've been working here for 2 years this month. I got my architectural education at Howard University. It is a 5-year architecture program, and I graduated in 2020 with my master's degree in architecture. And I pursued architecture as a course of study because I was interested in a career that would allow me to engage with people and communities. And with architecture, I noticed how particular buildings and structures hold and represent cultural values for various groups of people And for those same reasons, I'm also interested in historic structures and preservation. Many historic buildings retain the narratives and histories of neighborhoods and community groups, and the ability to preserve such structures ensures that their legacies have a future. And at Howard, we did not have a dedicated historic preservation course. However, during my time there were buildings such as Founders Library, which is our premier building with the clock tower here. It was designated as a national treasure by the National Register of Historic Places. So I was able to see all of the events and the significance that took place with that. And then I was also able to engage with other historic buildings on the campus and then surrounding our campus in Washington, D.C. And that made it to where I really didn't have a choice but to notice and to participate with the historic aspect of my education. I was fortunate to work as a virtual intern for the ACHP during the summer and the fall of 2020. I read an article about the Hope Crew program at Morgan State University. And through the Hope Crew, the students in the architecture program at Morgan State practice preservation and conservation techniques on the historic buildings on their campus. And I was very envious of the program and wondered if the program could either expand to Howard or if I, as a Howard student, could participate with the Morgan State students. So I made a call to a phone number that was listed in the article and got connected with Susan. And she came up with the idea to adapt the ACHP's internship experience to virtual, because at that time we were experiencing the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And throughout the rest of 2020, I was able to work virtually with the Communication and Education Office of the ACHP. And most of my time I spent documenting Section 3 case studies that were to be featured in the Federal Property Stewardship Report, which is the 3-year report that chronicles the status of federal historic property management. And a few of the projects I got to work on as case studies were Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri with the World War II Black Officers Club, the Kennedy Space Center launch complex, the restoration of the Apollo Mission Control Center at the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, and some of the work with the Tennessee Valley Authority. After I finished my internship with the ACHP and after I graduated from Howard, I began working at Self-Tucker Architects, which is located here in Memphis. And Self-Tucker has been operating in Memphis since 1996. Our office is located in the, I guess I gotta get up and move. Okay, sorry about that. So our office is located in the historic Universal Life Insurance building here in Memphis. It is on the edge of our downtown. This building was designed by the architecture firm McKissick & McKissick, which is one of the oldest continuous Black architecture firms in the country. And it was built in 1949 in the Egyptian revival style. And I believe in 2007 is when Jimmy Tucker and Juan Self, the partners and founders of our firm, bought the building and began plans to renovate the office building that would now house our architecture studios. And then on the bottom floor of this building, the city of Memphis has offices located in their Business Diversity and Compliance office. In our top floor is our architecture studio, where most of our production team works, and where we also have conference rooms and other spaces are rented out for different community events. And this, in the process of renovating this building was added to the National Register of Historic Places and received historic tax credits in helping to fund the restoration of the building. At Self-Tucker, some of the projects I've been fortunate to work on include projects such as this one, which is historic Claiborne Temple. Claiborne Temple AME Church was the location of the for many of the rallies and the de facto headquarters for the Memphis sanitation workers in 1968, when they were striking against the city government for better working conditions and wages and to be treated more fairly with the rest of the city employees. It was in this church's basement that the iconic "I am a man" signs were created, and many of the marches that that supported this campaign started from this church. And this church is now located across the street from the FedEx Forum, which is where the NBA team Memphis Grizzlies play. As a church, the congregation died out in the early 2000s. And so for about 15 to 20 years, this building has been sitting vacant and has gone into disrepair. However, this is a 4-phase project. We are at the beginning of phase 3, which includes the interior restoration of this building. Phase 2 has just recently been completed. It is the exterior renovation of the building. And phase 1 is also nearing completion, which focuses on the stained glass windows. So the stained glass windows are currently being restored, and at the end of this year will be reinstalled into the building. The exterior envelope of the building has been completely redone with a new roof and new brickwork. And then the interior renovation is going to begin later this year. And phase 4 will eventually be a new building that will help to support the activities that will go on inside of this church. And this is an image of some of the community and building committee meetings that we have related to this project. So the people that make up the building committee are from different backgrounds and fields, but they're all stakeholders in making sure that this building has a future and a life and a use that could be useful to the city of Memphis. There are other projects that I could highlight and would like to highlight, but I know that I don't have much time and we don't have much time for the webinar, but I did want to at least mention some of the other historic properties that I've been fortunate to work on. The historic Melrose School, which is located in the historic Orange Mound neighborhood here in Memphis. This project is also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This school building has been sitting vacant for about 40 years, and it is now being revitalized to have a branch of the Memphis Library on the bottom floor, and on the top 2 floors, housing for senior residents. The historic Riverside Hotel, which is in Clarksdale, Mississippi, is undergoing restoration work. It is a historic hotel in Clarksdale for the fact that it is considered to be the birthplace of rock and roll. Is where Ike Turner lived and wrote what is considered to be the first rock and roll record. And it is also the location of where blues singer Bessie Smith died after her automobile accident outside of Clarksdale. And then finally, Collins Chapel CME Church is a church located here in Memphis. It is one of the oldest continuous churches in the city, and their building has just received grant funding from the National Trust for restoration efforts. And that's all that I have to present.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Always such a pleasure to see you. Nikita, before I turn to you, I would just like to add that Glenn mentioned the Hope Crew, which is a part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a little earlier when he was speaking. And for those of you who are not familiar with the National Trust for Historic Preservation or the Hope Crew, I suggest that you look at that link and take a look and read about it. The Hope Crew, which stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience, has trained more than 800 young people in historic preservation trades, and I believe their volunteers are well over 3,000. It's a marvelous program, and if you are not familiar with it and you're interested in learning more about historic preservation, it's a great group to look up. And now, sorry about that, Nikita. I'll turn
No,
to you.
right. That's a great plug for Hope Crew. Absolutely. I second everything you just said. Well, great. Well, I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to ACHP for the invitation. Let me go ahead and share my screen, hit the button. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and do a holistic kind of quick overview of different options, and then dig into what I've been focusing on in my career so far. So as Susan mentioned, my name is Nikita Reed. And so we're going to jump right in. One of the things that I love about the field of historic preservation is the fact that you've got so many options for how you want to be involved. So what you're seeing on the screen is it's actually the Element Detroit at the Metropolitan in Detroit. And so there were so many different people that were involved with making this project happen. This was done out of our Detroit office at Quinn Evans. And there were so many people who were involved. The building had been vacant for a number of years. And so there were regulatory and compliance agencies that were involved in getting this building up and running, advocacy organizations. There were also real estate and development personnel who got in to make sure that the building would be renovated and turned into a hotel. Obviously, the construction trades to do the work to make it happen, and then the architects and engineers to design what it was going to look like. And I realized that I did that in a little bit of a backwards order, because usually we start with the compliance, architecture, real estate go around. But I just wanted to show you how there's so many different petals that you can actually get into once you start looking at preservation as a field. And so I chose to focus on architecture and historic preservation, as well as the overlay of sustainability. So I consider myself a preservation architect that specializes in sustainability. And so I went to the University of Pennsylvania to get my master's in architecture, as well as a master's of science in historic preservation and the certificate of ecological architecture. I did have a background in architecture from the University of Virginia before I went to Penn. But it's one of those things where I knew from an early age that I wanted to go into the field, because I love existing buildings. I think that there's such power in place, and that buildings really help leave a marker on the built environment. I'm currently working at Quinn Evans. I'm an associate here, and we are one of the largest women-owned firms in the country. And we specialize in historic preservation as well as sustainability and architecture. We have landscape architects, we have historians, we have a whole number of people who are here making all of the things go forward to make our projects come together. And so typically when you're thinking of architecture, or historic architecture for that matter, a lot of the times people are only thinking of the base documents and the drawings that need to go into it. But there are other ways to get involved within architecture and within design. So for instance, what you see on the screen, there's a base plan under all of the colors. And so typically some of our architecture colleagues would then do the base plan, but then we have other colleagues who would then go and do the layering on top. So even if you're not familiar with Revit or AutoCAD or any of the other modeling programs, knowing how to use Adobe products, knowing how to use Affinity products to actually do diagrams on top of the architectural plans can still be a value add for wherever you're looking to start working. And it's more than drawings. Quinn Evans, we also do a lot of historic building information modeling, or we call it HBIM, as well as making sure that we are putting additional information into our building models. We're experimenting with virtual reality. We also do a lot of on-site documentation and exploratory existing condition assessments, as well as making sure that we are talking to the project team, both internally and externally, to explain to the community and get feedback from the community of what they want the building to evolve into. And we work with our clients, and we also make sure that there are a number of overlaps. One of the things that you may realize as you get into the profession is that there can be a lot of really jargon-heavy conversations that happen. So whether, with the ACHP, the SHPO, NPS, LEED or code or anything like that, so being mindful of the language that we're using and the audience that we're talking to helps us make sure that we are really making everyone be on the same page so that there's less confusion about what's going on in the process. And so the first project I want to share with you is Baltimore Penn Station. This building is one of the projects that we're working on out of our Baltimore office. And so this is the main train station for Baltimore along Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. And Quinn Evans is charged with doing the head house renovation. So that's the existing building that's there. And then Gensler is working on the addition and actually really the new building that's going to be constructed across the tracks. So one of the things I love about my job is that I am never doing the same thing twice. And every day is different. And so on the right-hand side, you see the main space of Baltimore Penn Station, that main lobby. The photo that's just to the left of that, that's the space that's above the lay lights. So these are the lay lights here from the underside, and then this is the lay lights from the top side. Also doing a lot of existing condition assessments to see what material is actually, what condition is it in currently, so we then know how we need to design it or redesign it. Sorry if y'all are hearing those crazy sirens right now. Yay, Baltimore. And so anyway, so there are a number of different conditions that we have to be aware of, work through, and assess. I also get to go on really cool lifts and a lot of behind the scenes spaces. And so there's the larger scale, like Baltimore Penn stations of the country. We're also working on Michigan Central Station in the Ford building out in Michigan, out of our Michigan and Detroit offices. But sometimes we also do smaller things. So this is at the scale of the row house in Baltimore. So we got to do the renovation of 38 different row houses on a block in Baltimore. And these buildings have been vacant for over a decade. Most of the roofs are in the basement. And you can see kind of these middle photos here. This was the starting condition of what we got there. And so being able to work with the developer, work with the contractor, and design something that would then be marketable and be able to be sold to be put back into good use for the community was something that was really exciting. One of the things that also came up through this, since the buildings had been vacant so long, the developer wanted to make sure that we were showing the community that there was more work coming, even if construction wasn't happening on specific properties at that time. And so one of the ways that we worked to do that was to engage local artists to then do different panels and things like that to show which houses would then have work coming to them soon, just depending upon the phasing of the project. And so this, this is the before of the art, and here's how it transformed even just the vibe of the neighborhood while we're waiting for the construction to start. And then here's what it was, so the before and then the after. And on the one hand, it doesn't have much of a change in the street presence, mainly because we needed to maintain the historic facade, and that was the entire point of the project. But the inside is transformational. And so from the rear being this to now this with the deck, that's going to be market rate is something that is really changing how people are enjoying the space in the neighborhood. And then the last project I wanted to share with you is the Ambassador Theater. This is another theater in Baltimore where it had been vacant for a while. The building has lived many lives. So it stopped being an actual movie theater in the 1960s. Then it became a church, a roller skating ring, a cosmetology school, a number of things. And so now it's going to become an artist development space for the community. And the developers have been really conscious to work with what the community wants to do. And so this is standing in the space, looking towards the front door. And the vision is that this becomes a multi-purpose functional space that can be used for performance, for movie screenings, and then also have dance space or dance studio space above on the second floor. There were a number of community meetings, also getting feedback from those who will be using the building, because that's always really important to make sure you're talking to who's going to use the building. And then this is another instance where the developer decided that we needed to show the community that there was something coming. And so again, they worked with local artists to be able to design some panels for the marquee to then install them over top of what's happening here. And then here is a vision of what the rendering and what the future will look like when we restore the marquee back to what it was in the 1930s, in addition to just putting the building back in good use. I know I only have a couple more minutes, so I know I'm talking real quick. But one of the other things that I've really enjoyed doing and been fortunate to have the opportunity to do is to be able to talk about race and preservation and really the context of the world that we're living in now, and how things that historically in the field we didn't really talk about explicitly, but now we're actually starting to do that. And particularly since all of us lived through 2020 and we lived through a number of historical moments that needed to be acknowledged. And so being able to have conversations at Quinn Evans with other colleagues and with other professionals about the intersection of race and architecture and preservation, sustainability, gender, how all of these things really play together is something that's been really fascinating and something I've been excited to do. And so as Susan mentioned, I do have a podcast. If you scan the QR code, that'll take you right to the page, but here's just a mix of people who have interviewed so far. And I'd love to highlight episode 27 with Ira Matt, who is actually at the ACHP and was very gracious with his time when we were talking about Native American affairs. So I'm excited to answer any questions. Particularly just wanted to make sure to share that there are a number of ways to get involved in the profession. So development, design, construction, agency review, you have options. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Nikita. I think you're a living and breathing example of how one can sort of create their own career made up of many different paths. And I was going to ask you to talk about your podcast. Would you put it in the chat for everyone, the link to that, so that anybody who missed it just now will be able to access it? Great.
No problem.
So now we are going to turn to Dr. Rachel Klein's presentation. And as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Klein is right now on a delayed flight somewhere over the United States. She is a historian and a history group supervisor with the U.S. Forest Service's Enterprise Program. So she was very sad to miss us today, but we are going to play a recording of her presentation. So Lynn, would you go ahead with that, please? Thank you.
And hopefully this isn't too disjointed from Glenn and Nikita's presentation on careers and needs of the preservation industry. For my segment, I'll be talking about how to go about getting that job, skill sets that are needed for you to anticipate, resources for degree programs and where to find job postings, what should go in a resume, and how to navigate getting a federal job if your interest lies there. Well, since I'm not able to join you to take questions, please feel free to email me anytime about the information I'm covering today or any other question that you might think about as far as getting a job. You can email me at rachel.klein@usda.gov. So a little bit about me. I've been a historian with the Forest Service since 2009, working specifically in historic preservation. I've written or managed over 170 Section 106 determinations of eligibility. I've written over a dozen historical contexts for various resource types, as well as written numerous historic property management plans, interpretive plans, National Register nominations, and even the foundational work for a recent National Historic Site. I've worked with nearly every SHPO in the country and the Advisory Council. I've evaluated everything from ranger stations and outhouses to mercury mines and even a 1957 Cold War era missile site. I'm also a hiring manager within my position, so I've written up many a job vacancy announcement and can speak to what a hiring manager is looking for. Next slide. Just a note to say that these views expressed are my own and not that of the Forest Service or the U.S. government, just my experience and my 2 cents. So if you're thinking about a career in preservation, where should you start? A great place to start is looking at what skill sets you have and what are the skill sets needed for the profession. Understanding skill sets is really important when it comes to selecting a degree program, what types of internships you might want to look for, as well as aligning yourself and your resume with jobs that you want to apply for. Listed here are a few of the highlights that I look for as a hiring manager. Research skills. Are you able to dive into records, photographs, maps, Sanborn maps, maintenance records, deeds from the clerk and recorder, oral histories, all kinds of sources, and compile a story? Are you also able to look at a building, a site, or a landscape and read it like a book? Understanding what you're looking at, as well as knowing how to go about finding records, is really important in compiling that story of that potentially historic place. Next is putting all of that information into context. What was going on at that time culturally, in the public mindset, or in that organization or government agency to need to construct and use such a thing? Taking classes in architectural history can help you understand those trends, as well as traditional history classes. Being able to put that building, site, or landscape into context is crucial for writing statements of significance. And understanding the parts of a building are critical in identifying integrity. Architectural history classes will cover those terms and provide resources for how to identify aspects of a building. Writing well is critical in communicating a site's story and making claims for significance and integrity. Being able to clearly and concisely write about place is vital so you don't lose your audience, whether that's a SHPO or maybe a natural resource program manager. They have to understand why this building is significant in order to buy into its preservation, or potentially why they should invest funding in it. If you've never written a determination of eligibility, a nomination, or statements of significance and integrity before, I would really encourage you to practice on a local building, even your own house. Look for internships and coursework where you will get to practice the actual work of preservationists and not solely focus on theory. Since my beginnings in the Stone Age, it seems like, I've seen technology dramatically transform from mostly paper and negative photographs to capturing mostly everything online. So get familiar with things like ArcGIS, spatial data, remote sensing, LiDAR, how to put together a story map. Find classes and internships that will teach you these tech skills that are emerging more and more as critical in preservation documentation. And finally, I would recommend taking courses or finding internships or volunteer work where you can understand literally the nuts and bolts of a structure. If you want to be able to treat or physically preserve historic buildings, knowing construction techniques and materials is critical in that work. The Historic Preservation Training Center from the National Park Service is a great space to learn some of that, or HistoriCorps is a really great volunteer organization that teaches you to learn this hands-on work. Next slide. So SHPOs require that the principal investigators on preservation documentation, like Section 106 reports, are completed by a person who meets the professional qualification standards for architectural historians set out by the Secretary of Interior. This includes a graduate degree in specific fields like architectural history or historic preservation, or by having a BA and then experience in preservation. If you don't meet these criteria yet, this is a great list to look at and work towards. Next slide. So where do we get all of these skills? Choosing a degree program is critical for not only learning and developing those skills, but also choosing what's best for you. Look at course offerings, opportunities for internships, and who you would work with. Who you work with, I found, is really key in setting you up for success. So don't choose a program simply because it's great on paper. Take the time to meet professors, learn about their interests, and determine if working with those people are a good fit for you. These are two great places to learn about degree programs, the National Council on Public History's website and PreserveNet. Both list tons of information on programs, degrees, and certificates to help you refine your search. And I can't recommend this next bullet enough: internships. Take as many as you can. This is the place to try out things. You might think you're really interested in one aspect of preservation, and you do an internship and find out, nope, that's not for you. So say yes to opportunities that you may have never considered before. I took just about every internship I could find during my graduate program, and it really set me up for a rewarding career. Education is absolutely important, but putting those skills to practice is what leads you to that job offer. Next slide. All right, so how do I get that job interview? A good resume starts with identifying your skill sets, your education, and your work experience. This is an example of what a federal resume requires: job title, length of work. In a federal job, they will track this down to the hour, so be specific, and listing your experience. So I want to draw your attention to the education portion. If you're applying for a federal job as a historian, they will look for academic coursework in your transcript. So it's good practice to highlight how many credits you have in history so they're not wondering. You might even attach a course listing so they understand how that class relates to history, if it's not obvious to someone in the field. Next slide. Here's a more detailed example of what listing experience looks like. Really call out the work you've completed, how many of something, What skill sets you used within that? What were some successes? What did you learn? Next slide. If you're interested specifically in a federal job, this is where you go, usajobs.gov, and I'll talk you through this just for a little bit. If you have more questions about specifically applying for federal jobs, please reach out to me via email. When you get on USA Jobs, you want to create a profile, and you can even save searches for various series or grade levels. When you create a profile, you can upload all of your documentation, your resume, your documents. If you're a federal employee, you'll know what all of these numbers and letters mean. If you're a veteran, make sure to upload your DD-214. And if, no matter who you are, upload your transcripts, both your bachelor's and your graduate degrees. I have seen people not get jobs because they didn't upload their bachelor degree. They just uploaded their transcripts for their graduate degree, and they were not even sent on to the hiring manager. They were just declined because they didn't upload that transcript to show, again, that they had that education credit. You can also make yourself searchable on USA Jobs. You can look through and refine searches. You can create preferences. I only want to look for searches in these states or with this grade level, for example. And you can save this search and it comes out every Sunday or something like that. Who practices history in the government? So the classic job series is called 0170. That's a historian. But these other positions also practice history. Recreation specialists, folks in landscape architecture, librarian, archivist. So don't just refine your search to the 0170, but think broadly. Again, remember to say yes to opportunity because you might never know where it will take you. Next slide. This is a space in USA Jobs I really want to call out. And if you're particularly, again, interested in federal jobs, this will really inform your resume. On every USA Jobs vacancy announcement, there is something called specialized experience. And this is where they list particular skill sets and things that they are looking for this job. Now remember, when somebody in USA Jobs is reviewing resumes, they're not in this field. They're just simply looking for keywords. So they're going to compare your resume to this specialized experience language. So read through this and make sure that your resume is speaking to and even sometimes replicating this information. Make it your own, but definitely ensure that you have this language somewhere in your resume. Next slide. On your resume, your application package, make it really clear who your references are. There's nothing more frustrating as a hiring manager than searching for your references information. List everything like their phone number and their email. You never know how a hiring manager is going to contact them, so make sure that information is there. Also, make sure that your references know that they are a reference. That's really helpful. When you submit a cover letter, I would recommend doing this. Some people don't, but I really recommend it. It helps that hiring manager get into a glimpse of who you are, if you're a good writer, things like that. In a cover letter, don't reiterate your resume. This is about the new position and not your old one. So think about how you could discuss what you have done and how you could apply it to this position. Make sure to hit key points in that job announcement. Really share your enthusiasm and specifically talk about how you want to grow in the position and how you could grow the position. And finally, I'll leave you with this. Call the hiring manager. They are typically listed in a USA Jobs vacancy announcement, and reach out to them, see what they're like. Like when I was talking about education, make sure this job's a good fit for you too. Talk to the person, ask what the new hire will be working on. That's a really great way to understand what the position is all about and figure out, again, if this is a position for you. So if you are interested in learning more about USA Jobs, I gave you, I think, 3 minutes there when I usually give about an hour long treatment to this type of webinar. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime and I can answer those questions for you. Again, sorry I wasn't able to join you live, and I hope you guys have a really good rest of the webinar. Bye.
Well, I think that's not bad for somebody who had to record their presentation at the last minute in an airport, right? So there you go. Okay, so Nikita and Glenn, glad to have you here. I just would like to add something to the chat, which I'm going to do right now. And that is the ACHP has compiled a list of places where those who are looking for jobs in any of our fields, architecture, historic preservation, archaeology, cultural resources management, any of the things that fall in that space. We've put up some different places you can look for jobs. The National Trust's job listings are up there, the National Park Service, etc. So whether you're actually a student and you're thinking about where you want to go next, or whether you're a faculty member at an HBCU, or whether you're someone who has a student, feel free to share that link with anyone you'd like to. So now we're going to turn to the questions and answers, which I know I've seen flying around on the screen. So Lynn, I'm going to ask you to take care of that. But first, I would like to thank both Glenn and Nikita and Rachel for doing such an excellent job. We really appreciate it. So Lynn, I'll turn to you now.
Thank you, Susan. I think I'm going to come onto the screen so everybody can see me. Hello, where is it showing me?
Yep.
Okay. One of the first questions we had was from Cameron in the Q&A, and I believe it's directed to you, Glenn. Was the project initiated by the city, or was it driven by a nonprofit or private entity? Am I correct?
Yes, and I think that's about the Claiborne Temple project. It was initially directed by a nonprofit, but the city is also a partner in helping to fund and restore the building.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm looking for questions. Another couple of questions for you, Glenn. Can you speak about 2 or 3 historic buildings Self and Tucker now is designing from scratch, or on which it now is bidding to design?
One project we have is we haven't started any design work, but we've been assisting a client with getting a building nominated to be on the National Register. And this building was a former business college that was located a few blocks away from where our office is located. And a client has purchased the building, and she's looking to revitalize the building. And the first step was to get it nominated. And I believe it has reached the nomination point. It's been accepted. I'm not accepted to the register, but has received approval to be nominated. And another project, I can't think of a current project, but we've assisted with other projects before getting to the design phase and doing things such as doing an assessment of the building and helping the clients understand what might need to be taken care of first in restoring their building, what needs are more pressing than others. So it could be a new roof, or it might be getting structural work done. I know we did that for a church in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm not sure why these lights keep going off, but those are 2 off the top of my head that I can think of.
Gotcha. You may have to wave your arms, Glenn. I assume the reason why, or just to kind of, for those on the call, when Glenn's mentioning that the first step of revitalizing the building was getting it listed on the National Register, a lot of times listing on the National Register can unlock some eligibility for certain types of funding. So be it historic tax credits or grant funding. So on the one hand, getting it listed on the register is a great way to acknowledge the history of the building. It also has some financial, or can have some financial implications as well.
Thanks so much, Nikita. I did want to ask you, though, turning back to the career aspect of the webinar, What is it that the industry is looking for? What kind of candidates and skill sets should they have that are in demand right now?
Yeah. So I think it's a couple of different things. I think Rachel did a great job of outlining kind of the different ways that we have the resume and types of skill sets. A lot of it, though, is also being coachable and asking a lot of questions. Take advantage of the fact that you are young, coming out of school. You are not expected to know everything by any means. So asking more questions to really understand what the process is, what needs to happen, and not feeling like you have to know everything and then not asking the question or being too scared to ask the question. One of the things that when we're working with some of our younger staff that are just out of school, we like to keep encouraging them to ask questions and to help them not be so down on themselves for not knowing the answer. It's like, you're not supposed to know the answer. You're young. Keep learning and be coachable. But then also it's technical skills. Technical skills as well as social media skills that can be helpful, helping to translate a lot of the work that we're doing to the general public. Because there does tend to be a little bit of silo talking. And so how do we get out of our silos to really share the exciting things that the world of preservation has to offer, like this webinar? And so there's always going to be the computer skills. Hand drawing is great, but also being able to know how to use a measuring tape, how to hold a scale, that kind of thing.
Great, thanks. There is a question for you in the chat from Pamela. She said, you mentioned getting into virtual reality. Can you please detail a few of the ways Quinn Evans is incorporating virtual reality?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things that's been really great with how our technology is evolving. So we do have some VR goggles, but one of the things that we're finding is that Enscape is now also allowing you to use your phone as a proxy. So instead of having to put on VR goggles, you can use your phone and kind of move your phone around within a space to see what it would look like from a particular point in time. And we used it on a number of different client projects, but one of the ones that was really impactful was we were doing a project for the Maryland School of the Deaf. And so being able to give the client, send them a link on their phone and then be in a space where they were then able to move their phone around and really visualize what the space would look like when it was constructed was really cool.
All right.
So Lynn, there's another question in the Q&A, but I'm just going to sneak in here with a question for both Nikita and Glenn, because I've always believed this is hugely important, and I would really love it if you guys would talk about this in your own experience. For me, one of the most critical parts of looking for jobs and moving your career in the right direction is networking. And I firmly believe that will get you openings and conversations that you never would have expected. So Nikita, starting with you, would you just talk a little bit about how you feel about that? And Glenn, then maybe you can as well.
Yeah, sure. So that is so spot on. At the end of the day, hiring managers, principals, people who are looking to hire people are people. And so it's really going to be, connections cannot be just undervalued. I know there was one big, large architecture firm I applied to when I was just out of school. And I applied, didn't hear anything for a couple of weeks. And then I happened to know someone who worked there, went out to lunch, and they're like, oh, you've already applied. Well, let me introduce you to a few people who work here. And then once I mentioned that I already applied, they're like, oh, well, you've already applied and you know so-and-so. Okay, well, let's actually get you in for an interview. And so it's one of those things where talking to people, sharing the experiences that you're looking for, the jobs that you're looking for. And also a note about networking. If you're like, oh, well, I don't really like talking to strangers. I don't really know anybody. I feel uncomfortable. Everyone feels uncomfortable, honestly. Like I still sometimes feel uncomfortable when I have to go talk to people I don't know. But everyone's there to really network and meet more people. So that's the whole point of it. But yeah, good point, Susan. Networking is super important.
I agree 100%. And just know that no matter who you are, you start all of this feeling uncomfortable. And so it's really just taking a deep breath and reaching out to people. Another great thing is just sending an email to someone who, for example, works at the National Trust for Historic Preservation and saying, you know, I would love to come in and learn about what you're doing. I realize you may not have any jobs available right now, but I'd just like to get a sense of what you think is really important to move into the field. People love to talk about themselves. and their jobs. So there you are in there with someone you've never met before, and you're on their radar screen. So Glenn, did I just give away one of your secrets?
I can add on to it. And also, while I was interning virtually with the ACHP, the Education and Communications team set up a lot of virtual meetings for me with people in different fields related to preservation and in different departments, whether it be on the state or the national level, and put me in contact with a lot of people just to get a feel for what is out there, what there is to do. And didn't mean that I had to go down a certain path. It just gave me an idea about what could be possible for me. And the networking really does pay off, especially when you do get on certain projects and you make connections with the people that engage with the building on an everyday basis, and you get to find out more about the building than what you just simply see with your eyes or what you get as it's project related. Some projects may not have plans to reference, but if you network and engage with some of the people, they might have photographs of what something used to look like. And because you've engaged with them, they don't mind sharing it with you to help you, to assist you along the way on getting the project finished. And there's also a lot of conferences as a student, take advantage of the student prices, and sometimes they're just free, so you can probably just walk in, and it does not matter if you are, no one's expecting you to have a full knowledge of the field. They know that you're a student, so they would be excited to see a student there, and you don't have to pay for any fees or anything, so you can attend sessions. And that's a really great way to network at conferences where a lot of people from across the country are in one place, and you get to see a lot of people who may typically be hard to get in touch with. You might be able to meet them there.
That's a great point. Thanks for mentioning that.
All right.
Lynn, I think there's another question.
There is. Thanks for your question, Darlene. If a building is within a national registered district and all the buildings are conforming to the district, does a specific building need to be singled out to be eligible for funding for preservation? Was Darlene's question.
Gotcha. So that is going to depend on the type of funding you're going after and if the building is a contributing resource to the historic district. The way that I'm reading that question, it seems like the building is in a historic district and is contributing. And so if that's the case, then if it was going after like federal historic tax credits, maybe even state historic tax credits, then it would theoretically be eligible.
Great, thanks.
Did we miss anyone's questions?
I don't
think
think
we covered them
so. As I think we mentioned that if there are any questions for Dr. Klein, we will pass them along to her, and I will send an email out with the recording from the webinar and any questions that are for Dr. Klein. So if you have questions for her, put them in the chat now and I'll collect them up and send them to her.
Thanks, Lynn. So I just want to wrap up by saying a huge thank you to our panelists today and to all of our participants for joining us. Please join us again for our 2 remaining webinars on April 26th and on May 24th.
Well, Susan, can I interrupt you? There is one more question I'd like to get to. Thanks, Rowan, for your question. Rowan said, thank you for the helpful suggestions and insights. I'm currently a history professor who is interested in a career transition into historic preservation. Yay! It seems internships and other ways to enter the field are primarily geared towards students. Any suggestions or resources for someone in Rowan's position?
Yes, I have some, and I'll start there. So one would be to look for firms that, preservation firms particularly, that have historian openings as a way to kind of get into the field. You could then also pivot into other positions, because assuming most firms, there are going to be a number of options to get into a number of different areas of a project. I would also say, if you don't already have any sort of graphic skills or familiarity with some of the graphic programs, that to look at those ones, but it's probably going to depend on which part of the field you want to get into. I would also say there's also great organizations, so like the Association for Preservation Technology, if you're interested in getting more into the materials side of the field, and even maybe the AIA has a historic resources component. There's also developer organizations, so it may just be looking around for and networking at some of the other organizations to connect with more professionals who can connect you to other job openings.
Yep, and I would also add to that, sorry, I'm just saying thank you to Allison. I would also add to that there are other jobs that are sort of half and half. For example, Dr. Klein is an architectural historian. And as we all know, history is very, very closely related to historic preservation. So let me just add that we are going to be offering a program this summer for students from HBCUs called Cultural Heritage in the Forest. Shayla or Lynn, if you could just put the link to the ACHP page in the chat, I'd appreciate it. And this is going to be a program that will bring students that are either in history or architecture or other related fields into the Forest Service to discover what it's like to do historic preservation on public lands and to learn about all the different aspects of it. And we also will be working on a second program that we'll have more information on in the future called Preservation in Practice, in partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Park Service. So be sure to follow our social media because Lynn keeps us completely up to date on everything that's going on. That's one of her great gifts. And I just would like to thank you all again. Please take a moment to fill out the survey that should pop up when you exit the webinar. We want to get as much information so we can give you what you need and what you want. And don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And with that, I will say thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.